right. Let's just explain a little bit about Jesus's language of the kingdom. And if you've had me in class before, this might ring a bell. The kingdom, or in the Greek, basileia, I'm referring here to verse 32. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. As you read through Luke and the other Gospels, it's relatively clear that more times than not, Jesus is not referring to a space with territory, but rather to his own ministry and the way his own ministry brings healing and reconciliation into the present world. So that's just kind of a linchpin for my interpretation of all the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels. And when I refer to the kingdom of God, that's principally what I'm referring to. Jesus's ministry of healing and reconciliation for human well-being. Notice that Jesus does not say that God wishes to one day, eventually in the future, give you the kingdom, speaking here to his disciples. Rather, Jesus simply says that God wishes to give the kingdom. And virtually everything in Luke and the other Gospels suggests that while the full consummation of God's kingdom happens only at Jesus's glorious appearance in the last day, God does nonetheless bring the kingdom into the present order of things through the person and ministry of Jesus and the community that Jesus builds around him. Do not be afraid, little flock, verse 32, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Why would the disciples be afraid of this? Well, if we go back a chapter or so, we can find several reasons that the disciples might be afraid, but in the immediate preceding narrative context, at least, the fear seems to be a fear of want, or perhaps more to the point, a fear of relinquishment, material relinquishment, along with a fear of outright material dependence. I'm looking specifically at the trajectory, and this is why it's good to have your Bibles open, the trajectory of Jesus's teachings beginning in chapter 12, verse 13. That's when Jesus shifts in his teaching to the topic of possessions and wealth. First with the parable of the rich fool, which I believe is coming up next Sunday. His greed leads him to hoard his abundant crops for himself rather than sharing his abundance with others, and then his death brings God's chastisement. You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So Jesus says, it is with those who store up treasures for themselves but are not rich towards God. You might notice that the language of treasure is something we have encountered in our first August passage for August, specifically in verse 34, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So that's one important preceding passage. But as we move closer to our assigned passage, we find Jesus developing this theme, or this concern of possessions and wealth still further, beginning in 12, verse 22, when Jesus counsels the disciples not to worry about basic provisions such as food, drink, clothing, concluding with this statement: do not keep striving for what you are to eat and what you are to drink, and do not keep worrying, for it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for the kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. It might be worth mentioning or reminding you that these interlocking themes of wealth, greed, possessions are very important to Luke. Or to put it more precisely, while all three synoptic gospels forward strong arguments against greed and the accumulation of possessions, Luke places considerably more emphasis on this theme. And I've given you some of those passages in your lecture outline. And those passages I've just really copied and pasted from my handout of Luke's themes. At any rate, by the time we reach our passage at verse 32, Jesus has made it clear that the disciple who is consumed with worry, not only about possessions, generally speaking, but even about the basics of food, drink, and clothing, that is a disciple who is distracted from the most important thing, which is God's mission in the world. So might be worth repeating. By the time we get to verse 32, Jesus has made it clear that the disciple who is consumed with worry about possessions and basic provisions is the disciple who is distracted from the most important thing, which is God's kingdom mission. You can see it right there in 12:31, right? Which is still on the screen. Strive for his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Where is the focus? Also bear in mind that Jesus has recently, at least in Luke's narrative time, recently sent out 70 disciples to participate in and extend this kingdom mission of healing. That was back in chapter 10. Those disciples are commissioned to cure the sick and proclaim the kingdom's nearness. Again, to participate in and extend Jesus's healing mission. But in doing so, they are to rely on the hospitality of others for their sustenance. Remain in the same house, he tells them, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you, cure the sick who are there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. And so their ministry is entirely kingdom focused. So that without their dependency, and this is, I think, the important point, without their dependency on the generosity of others, the kingdom mission would be compromised, or at least their participation in that. All of this context gives added meaning to Jesus's counsel not to worry in verses 21 through 31, which I have up back on the screen for you now. With all that said, what I love about this first August passage, when is Driggers going to talk about the actual assigned text? What I love about this first August passage is the way Jesus frames all of these expectations in terms of divine gift. In other words, Jesus's disciples are not merely instruments through whom God extends God's kingdom of healing and wholeness to others. Rather, disciples are also, and surely first and foremost, recipients of God's own kingdom. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. I think in my own teaching, a little self-reflective aside here, my own teaching, I really drive home the call of disciples to participate in Jesus's own kingdom mission of healing and reconciliation. A verse like this kind of stops me in my tracks and helps me realize what all you Lutherans already knew, obviously, right? Which is that this is first and foremost a gift that we receive. So, a verse like this will circle back and maybe help provide more nuance when I emphasize these things in my own teaching. The language of flock here obviously implies, I would say, Jesus's role as a shepherd of sorts, giving direction, protection, care and provision, connecting it to preceding passages. Under the care of a faithful shepherd, sheep need not worry about basic provisions for life. And Jesus adds to this the crucial detail, which I love, which is that the Father is well pleased to give you the kingdom. This same verb, well pleased, it's a single verb, eudokeo, well pleased, is used at Jesus's baptism, actually. When the narrator says, or when a voice comes from heaven and says, "You are my son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." That's in chapter 3, verse 22. I love that connection between God's good pleasure in Jesus and God's good pleasure in giving the kingdom to Jesus' disciples. It may sound a bit more like John's gospel when I say this, but I think we can glimpse also here in Luke that the love the Father has for and shares with the Son is the same love that the Father has for and shares with us. And specifically, we find here that God's love takes the form of pleasure, delight. God delights in us, takes pleasure in us, enjoys us. And if God delights in us by giving us the kingdom, then I think that that is a shorthand way, we might say, of saying that God delights in us precisely by healing us, reconciling us to God's self and to one another, and in all of this, empowering us to flourish and enjoy God and God's creation as God has intended from the very beginning. So there's a kind of reciprocity of delight, a reciprocity of enjoyment. But notice also that Luke can't say this without at once circling back to the matter of relinquishment and what we might call self-emptying, specifically on the matter of material possessions. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out and unfailing. The Greek there could mean inexhaustible treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I don't think it would be putting too fine a point on it to say that for Luke, the gift of the kingdom cannot be received. This is Luke talking, I'm just the messenger. The kingdom cannot be received by hands already full with earthly things, or at least the reception of the kingdom is surely compromised to an extent, because an abundance of earthly possessions and wealth by definition pulls people and communities into their own self-occupying priorities, worries, and anxieties. We all live this every day. Here I'm responding to the typical Christian bifurcation by which, speaking in character, I can enjoy all my abundance at this kind of earthly level, while my Christianity operates at this so-called spiritual, unseen level. And that, of course, makes my Christianity a kind of purely spiritual affair, removed from any decisions I might make about possessions and wealth in the present. But the kingdom, we must remember, is not some purely spiritual gift. It may have a heavenly divine source, which is precisely why Jesus, or Luke, calls it unfailing or inexhaustible. But it's not something that can be tucked neatly away in a strictly spiritual compartment in our lives. And here I'm theologizing a bit beyond the Lucan text, which I like to do. But I think the logic here is that we are material creatures of a sort, that is, embodied creatures. God did not create us as pure spirits, whatever that might even mean. So to the extent that the gift of the kingdom is for us as embodied creatures, it is a gift for the benefit and flourishing of our embodied creatureliness. Our life is embodied, our actions are embodied, our joys and struggles are embodied, and our relationships are embodied. So in giving us the gift of the kingdom, God's intention at least is to heal us at all those levels. Now, in a room full of Lutherans, it would be problematic, of course, to say that the gift of God's kingdom depends on our selling and giving alms to selling possessions and giving alms to the poor. But what we could do, I think, is reframe this as a question. And I think this question is in your lecture outline. What does it look like when God gives the gift of the kingdom? What does it look like when we receive the gift of God's kingdom? What difference does it make? There are many ways to answer that. The poor leper and the hemorrhaging woman would say God's gift looks like a physical restoration of sorts. And our third passage, the bent over woman, looks a lot like that as well. A socially marginalized person might say the gift of the kingdom looks like me being welcome to the table. And we'll talk about that in a couple of passages as well. But for the others, it looks like selling one's possession and giving alms, which of course means others benefiting from that gift or from those gifts. I don't think Luke is concerned with the precise order of things like the mechanics of our salvation. He's just concerned with what God's kingdom looks like. God's transformative power is not just about healing physical infirmities and welcoming outsiders, although it is that throughout Luke. It is also about a reordering of those deep behavioral patterns that pull us away from God's love and God's mission in the world, And Luke often gravitates towards the issue of wealth and possessions to make that point. So what in the world do I mean when I say in your lecture outline that this is both a preparation for and participation in God's renewal of creation? You may already be intuiting kind of the difference there. Let's start with the language of preparation, which is a matter of eschatology, referring here specifically to verses 35 and 40. You might have noticed that in verse 35, the tone shifts to that of expectation and eschatology. Specifically, Jesus seems to be referring to his own glorious, however cryptically, to his own glorious appearance as judge of the living and the dead, as our creedal language puts it. You'll remember that fancy word parousia, which you learned in seminary, that fancy theological jargon for Jesus's glorious end-time appearance. But it's not only for judgment, right? It's also, and I think more importantly, for the full and final consummation of his healing and reconciling kingdom on earth. This is the same Jesus, the Lucan and Matthean Jesus, who teaches us to pray, your kingdom come. What does that mean? Well, your kingdom come means your will be done, your healing and reconciling will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Which brings us to, I think, an important clarification. When we Christians speak of eschatology, what we mean by the eschaton, if you ever had that Greek flashcard, the other side of it says end, right? Eschaton means end. But it's not an end in the sense of termination, is as if creation will come to an end. It's rather the end of the present age of sin and evil and death. The parousia inaugurates the eschaton as a renewal and even a recapitulation of all creation, including humans in fully resurrected embodied form. This being a thoroughly Jewish belief, by the way, that Jesus and his followers inherited and advocated for. And with that said, it's probably not too hard to see how verses 35 to 37 describe the disciples' preparedness for the parousia. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. We see these metaphors kind of all over the Synoptic Gospels. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from their wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Much of this is obviously, metaphor or analogy. We await Jesus's glorious appearance, just like slaves waiting for their master, the house owner, to return with lamps lit to guide him home and welcome him. Before I unpack what little I can in those several verses, I do want to put up what I found to be a really, in an age when LTSS and hopefully all of our churches are wanting to dial up our initiatives in anti-racism and read text with a bit more cultural nuance. This is a passage that I took from actually a feminist commentary written by Barbara Reed and Shelley Matthews from Liturgical Press. I'm just going to read it in full because from our feminist perspective, Reed and Matthews writes, equipped with recent scholarship on the violence of slave systems, we are suspicious of the many ways interpreters have downplayed Luke's violent slave logic. I should add, this is not unique to Luke. You all know that. We, Reed and Matthews, refuse to draw moral lessons from these teachings predicated on slavishness and fear of annihilation, as annotators and commentators do when they affix labels to this section, such as watchfulness and prudence, or attentive and responsible. We refuse to soften the violence by referring to the slaves as stewards or service personnel, as if these persons were earning wages for freely chosen labor. We refuse to minimize the punishment for the disobedient slave manager described in verse 46 as merely a dismissal or rejection, when the verb dikotomese literally means to cut in two, punishment readily available to a slave master. Alertness to the times or faithful actions in service of Christ should not be motivated by a scale of light to severe physical beatings, such as slaves faced daily. I think that's one of the most important sentences in this passage. Moreover, as C. Smith has argued, the call to always be awake, answerable to the master's whims night and day, assumes a typical form of slave torture, sleep deprivation, and should not be celebrated as a call to virtue. Now, if it seems like this is going too far for just a few verses, again, we have to bear in mind that the verse of the parable that follows expands upon the slave metaphor quite a bit, never mind the fact that the Gospels contain many more such slave-based parables like this. And before moving on, I don't want to press this too hard with anyone. I'll just let you do with it what you will. But we should know that a metaphor is never just a metaphor. Metaphors have strong power, and this is something that Reed and Matthews are trying to communicate to us. So in appreciation of this warning, I'm not going to try and draw positive meaning from the slave metaphor itself, but we can hope, so I'm going to kind of tread lightly here, but we can nonetheless hopefully at least still glean from these words that preparedness for the parousia is important, even a vital framework for understanding the life of discipleship as a whole. In fact, I was just thinking yesterday in church as I was listening to a sermon on prayer that I don't think I could even muster the energy to pray at all if I didn't hold some basic eschatological hope that this story will somehow end well. So yeah, I'm waiting for something or for someone. Note, however, that in these verses, this preparedness is not exactly timed for the precise moment of the parousia, because no one knows that time. And that is appropriate because Jesus is trying to cultivate what we might call an ongoing lifestyle of preparedness, even a communal culture of preparedness, rather than a rote and hurried preparedness aimed simply at escape from judgment. That's where I think the slave metaphor breaks down even within Luke's own logic, because Luke ultimately, I don't think, is saying that our preparedness for the parousia is based on a fear of punishment. That's not where the larger narrative arc, I don't think, is pushing us, however problematic the precise language here might be. This is actually, I think, a logic we find across the Gospels, that discipleship is a kind of preparation for the parousia. But what is distinctive to this passage, of course, is the way Luke connects preparedness to the surrendering of possessions and our material assistance to the poor. This material renunciation and redistribution is both a way of participating in the kingdom that is breaking into the world and a preparation for the full consummation of the kingdom that Jesus brings at his final glorious appearance. Along those lines, I can't help but think of two important passages from Luke's second volume, the Acts of the Apostles, which I've listed in your lecture outline alongside those other teachings on greed and wealth. Just allow me to quote the one from Luke, or Acts 2 in full. The same writer: all came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. Day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. What we have in the Gospel of Luke then is Jesus beginning to build a kingdom community, a community that takes clearer shape in the book of Acts, a community that today's churches might do well to take seriously and learn from, a community that reveals to the world what God's will for all of creation is. And I understand the thorny issue of preaching hard lessons on wealth and material possessions in our churches today. But I was asked to explain a passage from Luke 12. So here I am doing that. Are there any questions? I'm remarkably more or less on time. We have a few minutes for questions, and I have not been great at noticing what's in the chat. Nothing's in the chat. I'll give you a minute to think of questions. How's that? Maybe you're just drinking from a fire hose and recovering. I don't know if I could ever be the one that speaks up in a Zoom room full of this many people anyway, to be honest.
I don't see anybody raising their hand, but if you cannot see the documents I put in the chat box, if you'll just message me personally, I will make sure you get them if you came in after I posted them. So just send a chat to Jill Henning.
Richard Garris raised a hand.
Hi,
Hey,
can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, cool. I was listening to a podcast. I'm going to try to put my hand down while I talk, with Richard Rohr, who was talking about how it's sort of the effect of, he thinks an original wound that everybody has is like a father wound, which is why he thinks Jesus calls God Father. He's just trying to maybe redeem the masculine language that's used for God so often. I think that's one of the corrections we try to make, rightfully, that all the language is sort of overly masculine in the tradition. I'm wondering about the same thing with like master-slave relationship, if there's anything redeemable about the way that God would subvert everything it means to have power over somebody. Or if, I mean, I don't trust myself at all enough to do that well. I think it feels like a brick wall of like, I know this is really problematic language, but it's also coming out of Jesus's mouth. And how do I help congregants wrestle with that? Do we try to redeem it at all? Do we just say this is problematic and that's important to name?
I think my own view is that we name it as problematic. I could probably stand to do that a bit more, more than just a token, policy statement in a syllabus, but I think there are ways of redeeming it, at least in terms of the father language, in terms of just using other kinds of pronouns and words. I don't think we should expect, and I say this as someone who, and those of you who know me know I'm speaking the truth on here. I mean, I have totally bought into the Nicene creedal, Chalcedonian creedal definition of Jesus. Like, I'm taking that to the bank, and there are a lot of hills that I won't die on, right? A lot of battles I won't fight, but those are one. So and with that caveat, I will also say that we probably shouldn't expect someone in the first century to be, whether it's Jesus or a writer that comes after and retells stories of Jesus, or an apostle that comes after Jesus and writes letters, that we shouldn't expect them to be completely and magically removed from their cultural context and the language that creates that context. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is that within the 2 or 3-ish years of Jesus's ministry, that ministry can't fully realize its liberative potential, right? And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the church and the gift of the Holy Spirit, right? That the church is empowered with the help of its own scriptures as they evolve somewhat after the fact, but we do end up kind of having scriptures and experience and reason to kind of tap into the full potential of what the Son of God was doing and moving towards. And I think one, we're in a couple of those examples here with, our God language and, analogies of slavery. They're metaphors. Of course, when we move to Paul, we also have just instructions for, explicitly directed to slaves to stay in their place. So, what we shouldn't be surprised to find the early church, as it's reflected in scripture, sometimes working at cross purposes, simply because you can't just escape your own cultural context magically and realize in one fell swoop all of the potential that this man brings to the world, and that will only be fully realized at the eschaton, whatever that looks like and means.
Thank you.
There was one chat question that came in. How can these passages be related to increasing giving? Nothing like throwing a softball to you.
Oh gosh, I don't think I'm the strategic leader that you all are supposed to be on these issues. I'm sorry to say, what I love about it's the perfect question in some respects, because the two are, there's clearly a relationship. That's an important trajectory. It's not only about giving to the church though, but about how the church budgets its own resources, and also how individuals budget outside of even their church giving, right? So you can budget a ton for the church and be maybe even its biggest donor and still not quite and still kind of hold problematically to wealth and possessions in ways that can kind of compromise your discipleship and your participation in this kingdom mission. So I'll affirm the logic of the question and the direction it's going, and others who are more experienced in this kind of stuff may have answers, with apologies to whoever asked the question. And we're never far from stewardship questions in Luke, I think.
And Greg Hoffman put a point in the chat box as well. Says, to Dr. Driggers' point regarding Jesus's word choice, Luke 2, verse 52, he grows in years and wisdom, even within the scope of this gospel text.
That is someone who's had me in a class. Absolutely. The story, I'll move on to the next passage, but the story I like to tell in class is that one of my favorite movies, Major League, where the veteran pitcher, I forget his name, but he gets in an argument with, he's like this evangelical Christian, and he gets in an argument about whether or not Jesus could hit a curveball. And it's one of the best lines in movie history. Are you telling me that Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball? But I like to lift that up just to kind of give it like an extreme kind of test case of, Jesus Jesus's embeddedness in a first century culture. Awesome. Well, let's push. I don't know. I've got some energy. Let's push through, and then maybe we can take a slightly longer break. I'm afraid that with each passage I have more to say, which wasn't my intent, but it might have been the result. Here we go. So as before, let's just take a minute. There's the passage. Just take a minute to read that. That's not it either, is it? There we go. Take a minute to read. This is the next passage for August 14th. May seem counterintuitive, but I think actually the best place to start here is with verses 52 and 53, which speak to how Jesus's ministry leads to a kind of household disruptions, as I put it in your lecture outline. Previously in Luke, Jesus has already at least implied how the inbreaking of God's kingdom forces a redefinition of true family. And this is actually a passage that, if you follow the dominant theory, Luke takes from Mark. His mother and his brothers came to him, but they could not reach him because of the crowd. And he was told, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to see you." But he said to them, "My brother and my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it." That's a somewhat tamer version of Mark 3, a statement in Mark 3, compared to that statement in Mark. Luke, I think, kind of dials down the antagonism between Jesus and his own family, but he at least retains this rather radical statement about redefining the family. And it's radical because in Jesus's day, the family was the primary source from which one drew one's identity. It's what we call a collectivist culture, where you didn't think of yourself principally as a kind of autonomous individual, but as someone who belonged to a larger group and drew your identity from that group. The most influential of those groups being one's family. Bearing in mind also that in Jesus's day, family referred to extended family, right? The broader household that included possibly grandparents and aunts, uncles, maybe cousins, if not also great-grandparents. It was not just the nuclear family as we have come to understand it, which meant that in many cases it was also somewhat more concerned with family legacy. If you can relate to the idea of your own family being the primary source of your own identity, then just expand your definition of family to an extended household, and then amplify your feeling of loyalty and social pressures towards loyalty by about 50 or so. And then I think you get a bit closer to Jesus's ancient culture. And with that heightened sense of historic family loyalty, imagine seeing Jesus point to a room full of other people who he's not even related to, and then saying, "My real family consists not of my blood relatives, but of those who do God's will." And now 4 chapters later, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus speaks in even starker terms about how his kingdom mission divides households. "Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." Over the last few decades, more liberative approaches, we might say, to scripture have well noted how passages like this can work against kind of oppressive social systems that can be anchored even in family life. So, for instance, through a feminist lens, we can see in these verses the potential for undermining patriarchy, perhaps. Through a queer lens, we see the potential for challenging strictly straight definitions of family that are centered on reproduction and child rearing. That's an insight I took from the Reed and Matthews commentary. At the same time, Reed and Matthews note that Jesus' statement does not seem to address the system of slavery, so the liberating potential has some limits. Those members of the household are not named here. The theologian in me wants to say that this is not just about family household kinship, right? But also a broader dynamic whereby the inbreaking of God's kingdom decenters all conventional forms of association and affiliation, decenters, or at least those forms of identity that don't derive directly from God and therefore hold the potential to undermine God's healing and restorative work in the world. I want to say, for example, that God transcends not only our families of origins, but also our national affiliations and even our personal intersectional identities, gender, race, sex. After all, God is not a race or a gender. Get to Richard's point. God is definitely not American or Canadian or Russian, and God is not a Driggers or a Johnson or even, sorry, Jill, a Henning. But bear in mind, God transcending and therefore decentering all those forms of identity doesn't mean that God rejects them. Rather, and this is a statement I think that's in your lecture outline, the inbreaking of God's kingdom disrupts our ordering of the world, reordering it towards wholeness and therefore justice. Justice would then mean, here we can bring our intersectional identities back into play. The reordering towards justice means racial justice, sexual and gender justice, and as we've noted in our last passage, economic justice, although I probably could have done a better job fleshing out where the justice isn't at, but hopefully you can get it. So please don't hear me say that, racial identity doesn't matter, or sexual orientation doesn't matter, or gender identity, or national identity, or family identity. The point is rather that all these things matter as elements of God's beautiful and wonderfully diverse creation, and that the restoration, the healing of that creation proves disruptive to the extent that it moves towards a more just ordering of those factors. And with that said, returning to the matter of the family as it's described here in our passage, certainly in Jesus's day and culture, and still to a certain extent in our own day and culture, the radicalness of this kingdom disruption and reordering is probably best seen in its impact on the family. Moving now to verses 52 and 56, we find Jesus chastising the disciples for their failure to interpret the times. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say it is going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be a scorching heat, and so it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Seems like Jesus is just like jumping all around the different topics here, but I think we can make some connections. And I don't have a ton to say about this. The charge of hypocrisy strikes me as a bit harsh, given that the disciples are just kind of learning things on the fly like we all are. So let's not beat them up too much in our preaching. But that harsh rhetoric does or may help to accentuate the urgency of Jesus's words. The present time, as the NRSV puts it, in Greek, it's just this time. The present time is no longer simply just the present time, but the present time into which God's future kingdom is breaking. The present time, which is witnessing in Jesus the upending and reordering of conventional sources of identity like the family. According to Jesus, these disruptions are signs that should help disciples interpret the full weight of the moment and what's happening in the present time in which we all still live, a moment in which Jesus continues to bring to us and to our communities God's restorative, healing, reconciling power. reading between the lines, it seems we could also turn this logic around and say, to the extent that these disruptive signs are taken away or ignored, we fail to see or are blind to the full reality of what God is doing among us. We even hold greater potential to reject what God is doing among us. I don't have predetermined answers to these questions I put in your lecture outline, but I put them right there. Hopefully you can see them. They're not in my PowerPoint. In what ways might our personal allegiances to family interfere with Jesus's kingdom mission of healing in our lives? In what ways might our church's allegiance to families interfere with Jesus's kingdom mission of healing in our midst? Seems counterintuitive with all the, as important as families are to our churches. I was, helping with VBS this week, and you can just see these vibrant family units participating in VBS with their kids, but also on the volunteer side. If we didn't have families, we wouldn't have churches. And yet Jesus comes, in some respects, bringing division and redefining what true family is. And so I think these questions in your lecture outline are worth asking. And that brings me finally moving backwards to the opening verses of this passage, which frame the entire teaching as a teaching about a kind of eschatological judgment of sort. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. I've already read verse 51. There are other references to destructive or cleansing fire in Luke. Some of those come in the passages I've given you in your handout about eschatological judgment. But I'm just going to put them here and let you read over them. Just take a minute to read over these. These are references to fire in Luke. You can see how fire denotes a kind of judgment of sorts in most or all, but we have to bear in mind, at least in the chapter 3 references at the top, which I think are the most relevant for our passage, the fire is functioning as a metaphor. In fact, even I would probably do enough exegetical gymnastics even to get the last two passages metaphorical in some respects, but that's probably another conversation. As a theologian, and some of you already know this, I'm very hesitant to ascribe to God the literal destruction of God's creatures and creation. And by very hesitant, I mean I don't do that. I don't believe that God is in the business of annihilation or outright punitive destruction. I'm sure that's a conversation for another matter. Maybe you can ask a question in the chat. But in the meantime, and I've discussed it with some of you in similar preaching forums, I think, but I'll just channel that argument right now into this one passage from Luke. And it's not that Luke doesn't have a robust theme of judgment. You can see in the handout on Luke and themes, specifically under point 4e, the passages in Luke that seem to speak in various ways about eschatological judgment. Like Matthew, Luke kind of dials up the judgment motif that he inherits from the Gospel of Mark, working with that theory. For now, I'd just like to point out how fire as a metaphor can connote not simply destruction, but also, it would seem, and maybe more importantly and helpfully for our preaching purposes or theological purposes, purification or cleansing, which, across human culture is an equally common way of metaphorizing fire. I'm looking specifically at that statement in chapter 3, verses 16 to 17, where John the Baptizer says, "He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire." It's instructive to see that alongside verse 49 in our own passage. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Look at those together and ask yourself, where in the public ministry of Jesus do I see destruction in the sense of, annihilation or punishment? I don't think you can really find it in Jesus's public ministry. What you find instead is a mission dedicated entirely to healing and restoration and recreation and human flourishing, and yet it does create some debates and some polemics. But the gist of Jesus's ministry, as far as his actions are concerned, move entirely towards human healing. Then ask yourself, what I admit is the more challenging question: is Jesus's role as final judge different than his role as kingdom healer? Is there something about the parousia that unlocks a different side of Jesus, a side that must destroy, at least in some order, in order to recreate everyone and everything else? That's the picture we often find or force ourselves into, especially when we read, I think, largely metaphorical parables of judgment as kind of literal description. Alternatively, what if we could approach those same parables of judgment and metaphorical statements like verse 49 with the working hypothesis that Jesus's role as final judge just might conform entirely to his earthly mission of healing, restoration, and recreation? I think verse 49 in chapter 12 of Luke gives us an instructive push in that direction. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. In what ways does the ministry of Jesus bring fire to the earth? Well, we've already kind of covered this, because Jesus himself goes on to say that he brings fire to the earth insofar as his kingdom mission disrupts and upends conventional paradigms, we might say, of human affiliation and identity, specifically in this example, the family. It's not a teaching about destruction. It's certainly eschatological to the extent that it is a disruption caused, as it were, by the kingdom of God breaking into the world. And it is certainly a kind of judgment, at least in the sense of a reckoning or a cleansing or a purifying. If you've ever spent some time learning or experiencing family systems theory, this might make more sense. Dysfunctional family systems, which, and it's kind of all our families to a certain extent, those dysfunctional parts of our families don't always feel dysfunctional insofar as we simply find them normal. Even in the elements of dysfunction, we find an element of comfort, because that's the system we know, and because we often love the people in that system, however dysfunctional it can be in various places. But the healing of the system can ironically bring discomfort and even pain insofar as the healing proves disruptive. Just naming a dysfunction can be painful, never mind the longer process of living into more functional patterns, or in extreme cases, which is sometimes the appropriate case, separating oneself entirely from the dysfunction to find health and healing elsewhere in an alternative family system. I think this system framework, at least for me this week, this moment, is helpful for interpreting Jesus's jolting claims in verse 49 to 51. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. You think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. And just to be clear, Jesus, my point in invoking, a kind of family systems analogy is not to say that Jesus thinks that all families are dysfunctional and need to be, fully recreated. And it's certainly not that Jesus's mission per se is to divide people. Of course not, quite the opposite. But the mission brings division by virtue of its disruptive nature, or more to the point, by virtue of the disruptive systems we've created, whether in our families or in, to invoke the last passage, the way we use, handle, distribute our wealth and our possessions. Or as we'll move into the fourth passage for today, the way we arrange hierarchies of social class around a table for meals. Because so many of our systems are dysfunctional or have elements of dysfunction, especially in the sense of being unjust. Jesus is eager to kindle the whole earth with his baptism of fire. In fact, the term kindle in Greek could just as easily mean set ablaze. I love that. Kind of prefer that. It's a bit more jarring. And that translation paints a better picture, I think, of the all-encompassing nature of Jesus's fiery mission. The disruptive yet ultimately purifying and healing power of Jesus will burn through all of creation. It's the same word that James uses in James 3:5 to say that the tongue or the gossip is like a great forest that's set ablaze by a small fire. It can mean kindle, but the broader context to me suggests something a bit more jolting than that. I want to note finally what I found to be a very provocative statement in the Reed and Matthews commentary. It's a statement about the weather analogy, just to circle back to verses 45 to 56, and then I can take questions. These are the verses we're talking about reading the signs of the rain and the south wind and the scorching heat. Reed and Matthews note that in our own time, in contrast, signs drawn from the weather are not analogous to our eschatological crises. Rather, they constitute our crises. The devastating rains and scorching heat faced on the planet in the 21st century forebode a climate crisis unprecedented in human history. I don't really know what to do with that observation, I have to say. I always feel a bit helpless on this topic. I just found it jolting enough that I wanted to pass it along, if only just for your own kind of, thinking and meditation. It's obviously not an observation about Jesus or Luke's intended meaning, but I appreciate how Reed and Matthews nonetheless find these verses relevant, however indirectly, to our current climate crisis, which ironically is manifest these days in destructive fire. And the seminary faculty here at LTSS is hoping to roll out a new student outcome that has to do with the stewardship of creation and something related to sustainability. So it's kind of on my brain a little bit more and may have popped out at me in reading that commentary more than it might otherwise have. I've said a lot more about this passage than just that. So yeah, any questions or comments?
I'm not finding my raised hand. Sorry, I'm just gonna jump
Yeah, that's cool.
in. So in my what is this? Harper Collins in RSV, this verse 53 gets offset as if it's to note that it is not normal speech of some kind, but some sort of reference or poetic language. What is there something going on there?
I don't know if I've come across a justification. I can understand how the passage reads kind of rhythmically. I've never come across, I'm not saying they don't exist, Matt. I'm just saying I've never come across myself, not really looking for it either, an argument that justifies the offset as a kind of poem almost. It'd be interesting to look at other English versions and see if it comes across the same way. Richard says Micah 7:6. So if it's in fact a kind of gloss of Micah 7, and if Micah is writing in a kind of prophetic poetry, then that might be the connection that they're trying to, whether it's justified or not, kind of recreate the poetic style of Micah, even though Jesus doesn't, say, as the prophet Micah said,
No, that's helpful. I do see that I missed a page turn that does reference that Micah verse. So thank you. Appreciate it.
It's one of the reasons I still love the Harper Collins Study Bible. It's just so good at cross-referencing potential scriptural, quotes or allusions. This is a side note, but in the last couple of years, I've actually changed New Testament Bibles, and I've gone in the New Testament survey course to the Jewish annotated New Testament, which does a lot of hard work combating anti-Jewish interpretation. I would recommend it to everyone. At LTSS, we're now going back to a Bible survey. I don't know if you caught wind of that. It comes with benefits and challenges, but I can't use a Jewish annotated New Testament for a Bible survey class, so I'm probably going to go back to the Harper Collins for the reasons I've just stated. And I've actually just heard that that a revision is in the works of maybe the annotations. I'm not sure. It's one of those things you don't click and you don't quite remember what the headline was. Something going on with the Harper Collins Study Bible, I think. Or maybe it was the NRSV. I don't know. I should stop talking.
Yeah, there's an NRSV updated edition.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Now.
Dr. Driggers, was that the complete Jewish study Bible or the Jewish annotated New Testament?
Jewish annotated New Testament. It's really, really, really good. I would definitely purchase it.
I just want to make sure I put the right one.
Yeah, no, it's the one, and it's the one edited by Amy Jo Levine. It has really helpful, and it may even be in the handout I gave you on combating anti-Jewish interpretation. It's probably in that.
I just put the link off of Amazon for that.
Yeah,
if you go by Kindle, it's 46% off, but it's $35 to buy.
I do not get any money for that promotion. It just really is that good, and it's obviously not the only thing you're going to want to read or to consult, but it's all the annotations and the introductory essays are all written by Jewish scholars. It has virtually each book in the New Testament has a series of kind of inset short essays that deal with kind of the anti-Jewish red flags that might be popping up in those books. Some of which you might have already know from seminary, but a lot of them we didn't have a chance to cover in seminary, wherever you went to seminary. And some of them, I suspect, your Christian seminary professors might not even flag themselves. It also has a number of excellent essays in the back that clarify Christian caricatures of ancient Judaism and present day Judaism on matters related to history and culture. On the issue of family, even there's one on family life. And then finally, a really good essay by Amy Jo Levine herself, which is just kind of naming the most common Christian stereotypes of Judaism. I used to assign an earlier essay of Levine's along the same lines, but the one that's in the back of that is of the Jewish Annotated is more succinct. I've forgotten everything that I said about this passage.
For me, when I was looking at your question that you put in the outline about, in what ways might our church's allegiance to families interfere with Jesus's kingdom mission of healing in our midst? In my particular role, a lot of times what we hear at the Synod office is why does the ELCA have to be too political? Most of the times it's people who are complaining about the lectionary, and that somehow these fine preachers just pick these random passages when there's something political going on in our world and then preach about it, as opposed to really understanding the lectionary. And I do think that, oftentimes, we don't want to be political, but yet the gospel calls us to maybe have division. And this passage is one that really does call us to what does it mean to live as a disciple in this world, because we are in this world. We're not separated from that. So if family is the wording that Jesus is using in this passage to talk about, for those folks at that time, that was their community. For those of us that don't live with our extended families and have more fake family, or friends that are family, or community that's family, there are times in which the gospel will divide us, depending on where we are in our own understanding of who our neighbor is. And so, I think, I'm not preaching that weekend, and I'm kind of thankful I'm not. But I think it could be a little bit of a hornet's nest in terms of how people see that, and especially in this culture where we are, preaching in a purple world.
Yeah, well said. And I think it will be important for anyone who's courageous enough to kind of move in this direction, just to name that the mission itself is not division. And that's where I think, the first couple of verses there can be tricky. I came for division. You can pull that verse out of Luke and out of the New Testament and put it on a blackboard, and it sure does sound like that's the purpose of Jesus's mission. But the broader context of Luke and the Gospels and the New Testament as a whole is a strong counterbalance to the effect that the mission is first and foremost, and I would argue entirely, one of healing and restoration and reconciliation, not division. But because of our embedded dysfunctional systems, and I don't think we would want to just name family, but family is like a great test case because it cuts so close to the core of our identity. Because of our own sinful systems, healing proves disruptive. So I think that distinction, clarifying what the true mission is, despite what that one verse might appear to say on its face, I think will be an important part of any sermon that wants to move in this direction. Yeah, I agree, Donna. There's someone else raising their hand named Joel. Yeah. Hi, Joel.
Hi, I live by Chicago. I'm just wondering, I'm reading a book now. It's an older book called Failure of Nerve. It's a really good book. I'm in the process of trying to figure out how to be decisive, but not to be a dictator. And it's tricky for me. And I'm thinking of you down south, and I don't know if it's more difficult down there. I don't know if it's, there's stereotypes that there's more Republicans down there. I don't know, but I think there is a lot more big churches down there with pastors who are, well, you know, like Joel Osteen type pastors. And to me, he is the most dysfunctional human being I've ever met. I'm not sure where I'm going, but I just feel for you guys. But we have to be decisive. We have to be strong. We have to take risks. It's just life, right? And it's rough enough in my congregation. So I just wanted to share that, okay?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I don't have a great insightful answer. I suspect that every part of the country has its own challenges. I would need another 3 hours to move into the challenges of living in the South, where I'm from. But yeah, and this you may note already that, and I hope you forgive me for doing this, but I kind of move back and forth between kind of preaching ideas and leadership questions. And it might be just because while I'm always in biblical texts, and especially in gospel text, and interpreting them with and for students and pastors, and while I do preach occasionally, I think my strengths are more in kind of raising these, I think are moving more towards raising questions for leaders in a time when you can't, church leadership is no longer just open the doors and let people come in. So these are challenging times for leadership, and Jesus has a lot of things I think we can learn from him about, as you put it, Joel, kind of decisive, but surely also humble leadership. Can we, I don't know if this is going the way you wanted it or not, but I'm enjoying walking through the text with you. I'm wondering if we could take maybe 5 minutes. That'll give me time to eat a gala apple and get my own nourishment, and then we'll come back and dive into. So I wouldn't log out. I would just kind of close your screen or just go somewhere on mute, and I'll be back in 5 minutes to talk about passage from Luke 13. Sound good? Share my screen again. Go. So this is a passage that some of you know. I've been walking students through this passage every spring for probably 15 or 16, maybe 14 or 15 years. But I'll still give you a few minutes just to read through it silently to yourself. I'll start just by noting how the Jewishness of Jesus is on full display here at the beginning, at least. A Jewishness that unfortunately we sometimes need reminding of. We learned all the way back in Luke 4 that it was Jesus's custom to attend synagogue on the Sabbath. And when you think about it, having to tell an audience that it was Jesus's custom to attend synagogue is probably already a window into the potential for some hearers, presumably Gentile hearers, to lose sight of Jesus's Jewishness. I don't know if that makes sense. In other words, saying that a Galilean Jew was accustomed to attend Sabbath synagogue is kind of superfluous. Unless the audience or some members of the audience have the potential to forget or misconstrue Jesus's Jewishness. At any rate, Luke describes several occasions in which Jesus not only attends synagogue, but in his capacity as a locally recognized teacher, also teaches in the synagogue. Second important aspect of Jesus's Jewishness in this passage is the fact that he takes a vested interest in Sabbath law and the proper interpretation of that law, a matter to which I'll return momentarily. Right now, let's talk about the healing of the woman, beginning with how she comes to take center stage, because I think this says something about Jesus's capacity to see. Jesus has a kind of vision that we can also practice, I would argue, a vision that is carefully tuned or locked in to noticing people that others might not notice. And if we read too quickly through verse 11, we might come away with the impression that the woman enters the synagogue in a way that is obvious to everyone, if not somewhat disruptive to Jesus, the teacher. And I think the NRSV is kind of guilty of this, where the NRSV says, "Just then there appeared a woman." The Greek simply reads, "Behold, a woman having a spirit of weakness for 18 years. And I'm inclined to read that "behold" not as an indication that everyone all of a sudden noticed this woman, much less that she just kind of barged into the synagogue late, but rather that Jesus noticed her. If you've ever taught in a crowded room, you might relate to this phenomenon of noticing someone once you start scanning the room from the front. It may also help to know that the woman's condition would not have excluded her from synagogue worship. In fact, there was really nothing ritually unclean about her. And even if there had been, it would likely not have affected her synagogue participation. What we should probably imagine then is that this woman is a faithful participant in her local village synagogue, that the townspeople know her, or at least know about her, which also means that they are accustomed to her physical infirmity. Maybe even some of her family are there with her. We should probably also assume that the woman isn't attending synagogue in order to be healed, but simply to worship. She belongs to this community. There's no indication that she's been ostracized, although Jesus wants to bring her to everyone's attention. Initially, at least, she's just there with everyone else, which we can imagine was her custom just as much as it was Jesus's custom to attend synagogue. But Jesus sees her in a way that others do not. He sees her as someone he can heal. He may see her despite the fact that her physical posture renders her harder to see, depending on how crowded the room might be or the synagogue. That's more conjecture, I suppose, but it's still an interesting question whether the woman being unable to completely straighten herself made her more difficult to see in a crowded room. That would just kind of accentuate Jesus's kind of capacity to notice. Either way, there's a lesson here, I think, about how kingdom ministry requires kingdom vision. Here I'm doing that leadership thing instead of the preaching thing, I suppose, so I apologize for that. Jesus may have this vision by virtue of his special vocation as Israel's Messiah, but to the degree that we participate in Jesus's kingdom mission, surely we too can, with prayerful practice and intentionality, cultivate the same kind of kingdom vision, being alert to all those kingdom surprises that can disrupt our lesson plans. Moving now to the healing of the woman. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, she stood up straight and began praising God. So there's no questioning that the healing of the woman is a wonderful thing, right? After all, the woman's own response is to glorify God. For the first time in 18 years, she can stand upright. It may even be that she hasn't been able to look people in the eyes for quite some time, at least not in the ordinary course of daily affairs. It's an interesting and rewarding experience to read these verses carefully, even meditate on them from the perspective of the woman with sensitivity to how she experiences all this, sitting herself down initially to enjoy some communal Sabbath rest to the extent that she can, at least in her condition. Hearing the voice of Jesus teaching, but maybe not being able to see him very well due to her condition. Then hearing his voice directed to you, maybe not knowing exactly who he's calling for it until the people around you nudge you to the front. Hearing the voice of Jesus pronounce your liberation. You have been released. Feeling his hands touch you. And then immediately feeling the loosening in your back, allowing you to stand up straight. And the first face that you see, maybe the first face you see fully and comfortably in 18 years, is the face of Jesus. That's why I love this painting by Barbara Schwartz in the slide. So you came here to glorify God, but now that act of praise takes on considerably more personal meaning. And so on the one hand, as I put it in your lecture outline, on the one hand, it's a cause for celebration and praise, but on the other hand, there is the need for pastoral and theological nuance. And some of you have heard this important caveat before, that while there is no questioning that the woman welcomes her healing and that physical healings in the Gospels are without exception really causes of celebration, we have to be careful about how we appropriate this or any healing story in light of the experience of our differently abled brothers and sisters. And this is just kind of my brief soapbox, but it's an important one, I think, so I kind of carry it around with me wherever I go, that we have to understand that, physical difference does not in and of itself constitute physical brokenness. There's kind of an unintentional trap that's laid with almost every healing of physical infirmity in the Gospels. It's not a intentionally laid trap, but we have to be careful to avoid it. The Gospels go out of their way to show that Jesus heals broken bodies, partly, I imagine, because the historical Jesus was in the business of doing that, but also, I suspect, because Jesus and his biographers wanted to stress, in keeping with Jesus's own Jewish tradition, that the created body is inherently good and therefore an object of God's love, which means the kingdom of God is not some disembodied realm. I mentioned this with the first passage. Kingdom is not some disembodied realm to which we escape, but rather the eschatological renewal of the material world, including our bodies that belong to it. And viewed in that light, physical healings in the Gospels anticipate resurrection to some degree, but so there's a powerful theology, even a pastoral theology at work here, but at the same time, when we take the time to listen to the differently abled people in our midst and learn about their perspectives and their experiences, we must bear in mind that physical difference, again, is not necessarily experienced as physical brokenness, which means we have to bring pastoral nuance to our preaching and our teaching of these physical healing stories. I won't go into any more detail about that. I'd be happy to answer more questions after I'm done, but I uploaded, and Pastor Jill may have also uploaded, the same handout that has some resources that get started on this issue, some print resources, some denominational, some digital, on how to grow in our theology and in our pastoral leadership with an eye towards experiences of different abledness. And actually, this is fresh in my mind because I just watched it. I would also recommend the film Coda, C-O-D-A. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a wonderfully sweet, poignant, and profound movie about a deaf family. Although the story is focalized through the younger daughter who can hear, it's a really interesting and moving story. And while I'm on it, you might also want to take this or any healing story as an opportunity to plan a disability audit for your church. I don't know if any of you have ever done that, or maybe you haven't done it in a while, because it's hard to celebrate inclusion or talk about inclusion when our physical spaces impede accessibility. And an audit is a great way, I would think, to, I've never led one, but I suspect it's a great way to also just kickstart a congregation-wide conversation about differently abledness and the beautiful kingdom diversity that our congregations can embrace and celebrate if they just kind of live into that mission. Of course, there's one person in the synagogue who, at least one person, who does not celebrate, and that is the synagogue leader. Indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath." As more than one feminist interpreter has pointed out, it's unfortunate that the woman's wonderful Sabbath moment gets kind of hijacked to a certain extent by two male leaders and their theoretical arguments. And there's a great deal at stake when it comes to how we understand Jesus's mission and the extent to which the woman's wonderful Sabbath moment is consistent with the will of God in the world. So we do need to dive into both sides of the argument. I'll begin by noting that while a synagogue leader is likely not a Pharisee in any formal sense, he probably has some form of training that qualifies him for the title, given the fact that the synagogue at this time could simply be someone's home, a home with sufficient space to be designated a gathering place for weekly worship, periodic community events. We should not make too much out of this man's authority and prestige, but he does echo previous protests by Pharisees against Jesus's Sabbath actions in Luke 6. Luke 6 begins with 2 consecutive Sabbath arguments. That the synoptic Jesus interprets Torah through the lens of human healing and well-being. I think a lot of you have heard me say that before, and I'll return to that in a moment. Let's take note first of the fact that neither the synagogue leader, this is an important point, neither the synagogue leader here nor the Pharisees in previous debates actually are opposed to Jesus's ministry of healing and well-being in the general sense. That's a fault. The polemics can get so strong in the Gospels and they're so consistent. And I think our default is so quickly to not just take Jesus aside at the expense of understanding the counter argument, but just to outright disparage the counter argument, that we might kind of lose our bearings and think that they just oppose human healing and well-being. But neither this synagogue leader nor the Pharisees in these previous debates have said anything of the sort. At least some of them, however, and the Gospels suggest virtually all of them, and while I'm inclined to say that's an historical exaggeration, but some want Jesus to be extra careful, or they want to be extra careful that a prioritizing of human healing doesn't run roughshod over God's commandments. I'll say that again. They want to be extra careful that a prioritizing of human healing, which is all well and good, doesn't run roughshod over God's commandments. It was God, after all, who commanded the Israelites to refrain from work on the Sabbath day. And that's a rather ambiguous commandment, of course. The history of rabbinic, Jewish literature is chock full of debates about what work means. But this is the commandment with which we're probably most familiar, Sabbath commandment, that is, from the book of Exodus. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, whatever that means, right? You, your son or your daughter, your male, your female slave, your livestock, or the alien and resident in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. We should all remember, by the way, some of you have heard me say this too, that the Jewish call to obedience, whether with respect to the Sabbath or any matter of Torah, is not a matter of works righteousness, earning one's justification or salvation. nor was the Pharisaic approach to Torah one of works righteousness. Obedience was rather the human response to divine grace. Christians view obedience to God as our response to divine grace because Judaism taught it to us. Because Jesus was a devout Jew who had channeled that theology, as it were. Obedience as a response to divine grace. In that respect, Jesus enjoys considerable common ground between the synagogue leader here and the Pharisees and other debate scenes, I would argue. In fact, the synagogue leader has a compelling argument when you think about it, especially given the fact that the woman's condition is not life-threatening. Going back to verse 14, again, there are other days that you can come for healing. Now, at one level, the fact that the leader addresses kind of the crowds and implicitly the woman, it seems, rather than Jesus, does demonstrate maybe a degree of triangulation, if not also, it can kind of come across as victim blaming. You know, I kind of understand that kind of problem with the response. As I've already noted, it's not like the woman, though, comes to the synagogue seeking healing. So that's really not fair to the woman, I would say. We also have to remember that insofar as this man is a leader, it is appropriate for him to address the people directly. His job, his vocation is not principally to spar with the guest speaker. His job is rather to lead the people as best as he can in response to God's grace. And so he speaks directly to the people when he senses that they're being led astray by Jesus's actions. Because in point of fact, Jesus could have waited until sundown, right? Which by Jewish reckoning signaled the beginning of the next day, and then healed the woman. And in that scenario, Jesus would have been seen as taking extra care to honor the Sabbath while also lifting up the woman and her healing. In other words, Jesus could have had his cake and eaten it too. This is the perspective of the synagogue leader. As I put it in your lecture outline, his perspective is honor the Sabbath and then heal the woman. And we all go home happy. After all, the woman's condition, again, it's not life-threatening. Even the stricter forms of Jewish tradition allowed for Sabbath work in order to save life. But this woman has suffered in this condition for 18 years. Again, I suspect that she's not some new visitor, right? As Jesus might be. People know who this is. Waiting a few more hours, seriously, waiting a few more hours and thereby ensuring faithful, however liberally or strictly you want to define work in the Sabbath commandment, if Jesus waits a few hours, he goes the extra mile to ensure faithful Sabbath observance and can still heal this woman. When you think about it, like logistically, it's not a big ask. But of course, we already know based on and if you've had me in a class, you know I love to really sit in the shoes of Jesus's opponents, because if we don't do that, I don't think we quite capture the real impact and radicalness of Jesus's own teaching and kind of the more radical, liberating strands of Judaism that he channels in his own ministry. Because we already know, based on previous Sabbath scenes, in fact, back in chapter 6, that Jesus is not going to take that route. He's not going to wait a few more hours. Back in chapter 6, just before healing a withered man's hand, he posed the question this way: is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or destroy it? That's kind of a trick question that shows Jesus's hand. So we're prepared all the way back in chapter 6 for Jesus to prioritize human life, not at the expense of the Sabbath obedience, but actually as a kind of form of Sabbath obedience. And now here in chapter 13, Jesus substantiates that logic quite a bit more. He argues, you hypocrites, and maybe there are others there that are siding with this leader, I don't know. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? Let me say first, as plainly as I can, that this argument should not be read as a Christian corrective to a Jewish legalism, because, as I've already noted, it was Judaism that gave us this concept of obedience as a response to divine grace in the first place. And in fact, when it comes to these opposing arguments, these two arguments in chapter 13, both sides of the debate, I think, both the more restrictive side of the synagogue leader and the more liberal side of Jesus, have some precedent in the Judaism of the time. So again, this is not a Christian corrective to legalistic Judaism. This is Jesus channeling the really radical, compassionate trajectories of his Jewish tradition. But while Jesus does take the more liberal Jewish perspective, we must point out that he does so for not just kind of exegetical reasons, but for eschatological reasons, if not Christological reasons, because the kingdom of God is breaking into the world for the healing of the world, and because he is the anointed king who, in the words of Luke 6:5, is Lord of the Sabbath. At any rate, whereas the synagogue leader's argument is basically to honor the Sabbath first and then heal the woman, Jesus's argument is honor the Sabbath by healing the woman. Honor the Sabbath by healing the woman. It's an argument you may have noticed from lesser to greater. These kinds of arguments are common in all kinds of, philosophical cultures, in virtually every culture, including the rabbinic culture of Jesus's day. An argument from lesser to greater, it's kind of structured so that if it's the case for a lesser scenario, then it should certainly be the case in the greater scenario. The lesser scenario, of course, being that of livestock, which we see in verse 15. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? It would be ludicrous not to account for the health of livestock on the Sabbath, especially in a summer like our own here in South Carolina. But in principle, at least, one might argue that leading livestock to the water trough was work and therefore a violation of the Sabbath. So just give them extra water, I don't know, on the Sabbath or something like that. But I don't think anyone really argued that way. It was understood, in other words, that the work that went into providing for livestock was not a Sabbath violation. And using this scenario, this lesser scenario as a kind of premise, Jesus then reasons to the greater scenario. If we do this for livestock, then surely, now quoting verse 16, ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? So not only is the contrast between animals and a human, the human in question is not just anyone, but a daughter of Abraham. It's a rather unique phrase that Luke uses here, that Luke and Jesus uses here. And not only that, she's not only the daughter of Abraham, but a daughter of Abraham in need of a kind of basic provision. She's a daughter of Abraham under attack, held in bondage, and not just held in bondage, but held in bondage by Satan himself, Jesus says. It's kind of weird to wrap our minds around what exactly the woman's ailment is. Like, it's clearly a physical ailment. Jesus refers to it as spirit. Now he's laying it all at the feet of Satan, but it's not an exorcism. So there's some weird kind of blending of spiritual, physical kind of explanations going on. I wouldn't get too lost in trying to sort all that out. But it is certainly the case that at the end of the day, Jesus sees this woman's physical infirmity, whatever might have caused it in her life. And it could simply have been backbreaking labor, but whatever caused it, Jesus is identifying Satan as kind of the ultimate cause of her suffering. Again, don't get too lost in that, but surely you can notice the language of bondage and liberation. which we've already seen in verse 12, right? When Jesus says to the woman directly, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." And now in his response to the synagogue leader and in the hearing of all present, Jesus repeats that language, "Ought not this woman be set free from this bondage?" Those are cognate Greek terms, if I remember correctly. Luke's audience might be reminded at this point of Jesus's inaugural synagogue homily, I guess, in Nazareth. You'll remember it, when he defined his own mission in terms of liberation, channeling Isaiah's own mission of Jubilee, or announcing Jubilee, where he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Again, Jesus reading the scroll of Isaiah. "Because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This being ultimately what Jesus claims is being fulfilled in his own ministry. That's Luke's short and sweet definition of what Jesus's mission is. But it's not just a flashback to Luke 4, it's also a flashback to some degree to Deuteronomy 6, in which the purpose of the Sabbath, and this is the Sabbath commandment that we don't always remember as well as we remember the one in Exodus. But the Sabbath commandment in Deuteronomy 6 is grounded in the story of freedom and liberation from slavery in Egypt. So again, it's somewhat different than the Exodus explanation, which is about our participation in God's rest after creation. Of course, both are theologically insightful, compelling explanations of the Sabbath. But this one in particular is helpful for the Lucan Jesus. You can see it there in Deuteronomy 6:15. "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." By reframing the Sabbath in Deuteronomistic terms as a commemoration of liberation from slavery, Jesus is able to justify his healing of the woman as a way to actually honor the Sabbath. So far from violating the Sabbath, then, and even farther from setting aside the Sabbath commandment, Jesus is taking the Sabbath with the utmost seriousness. So just to repeat what I think is a previous point, at the end of the day, I don't think it would be enough to call Jesus's argument or Luke's argument strictly exegetical. The argument is also implicitly Christological. Jesus, the Christ or anointed king, inaugurates God's own kingdom on earth. It's a kingdom marked not by the conquest of territory, but by the healing of creation generally and human creatures specifically. That is the mission that animates Jesus, and everything else must conform to that mission. Everything else must conform to that mission. In fact, Jesus himself uses the language of must. It comes out in the NRSV as ought. In other English translation, it tends to come out as should. This is the Greek word for kind of necessity, but which for Luke also often carries a sense of divine necessity. In other words, the will of God. But you'll notice here on the slide that it's the same word that the synagogue leader uses to make an argument for what's necessary to be done and not done on the Sabbath. I point that out simply to accentuate the extent to which human healing and liberation animates Jesus's ministry, such that, again, everything else must conform to this mission. As I'm fond of saying in the classroom, from the perspective of the Gospels, if one's interpretation of tradition, whether it's scripture or anything else, even delays human healing, never mind impede it, but simply delay it, and in this case, just for a few hours, if that is where you land in your interpretation, or where we land in our interpretation of scripture and tradition, then from the perspective of the Gospels, we need to rethink our interpretation. Start over with the clearer understanding of the mission that governs our interpretation. That's what it means when I say that Jesus interprets Torah with an eye towards human healing and well-being. The questions I have for you, maybe we have time to answer it, a little bit of time maybe, in your lecture outline. What happens to your own ministry and to the ministries of your congregations when they become entirely animated by the mission of healing, God's mission of healing and human well-being? What kinds of changes might you anticipate when everything is made to conform to Jesus's mission of healing and human well-being? What is given greater emphasis? What is given less emphasis? You don't have to answer those questions. You may have other questions for me, but as you think of what a sermon might look like or sound like, those questions might move you towards some interesting ideas to share with your congregations. No chat comments that I didn't catch. Sorry, I'm just babbling. I'm reading them now. Yeah, those are both helpful questions, and I appreciate, I think, the answers that are implied. Yeah, I would agree with the sentiment behind those questions. Yeah, and I think in response to Justin Marks in particular, you know, I think I would argue that Jesus's Jewish tradition already gives the right answer to that question, which is that the law is created to help people. The law is the form that our response to God's faithfulness takes. Now, even within Jewish tradition, there is considerable nuance on how to interpret the law, with the full understanding that it's very ancient. A lot of time has passed. It reflects an older culture. You know, these are not insights that Christians are magically gifted with. Our Jewish brothers and sisters know that as well. And so they have, like us, done a lot of work interpreting how to best follow the law as a human response to God's grace. But the important part either way is that that dynamic is not something that Christians created, but rather something that they inherited, and that Jesus, I use this word more and more every year, that Jesus kind of channels from his own Jewish tradition into his mission of healing and reconciliation. So yeah, the law is created to help people and to strengthen this covenant relationship between God and God's people. Other questions or comments about this wonderful story that I probably did not give justice to, but I will say too, in my own teaching, that reading and meditating on the perspective of various characters in the gospel story is a really rich exercise that I've started incorporating in my own classes a bit more, setting aside time for that and allowing students to respond to what they experience. I even ask them to try to use all 5 of their senses if they can. Not only what you see and hear and feel, but is there something that you're tasting, or what are my other senses? I think I've left one out. But it's a really rewarding kind of spiritual exercise that helps these stories kind of come home. And this story, the bent over woman, is a particularly kind of rewarding test case for that exercise. Some of you may do Lectio Divina, where you just kind of move around a table and kind of share the words that pop out to you. But this kind of empathetic, kind of quasi-Ignatian reading in the shoot from the perspective of characters in the story is equally rewarding, I would say, spiritually. Am I just talking so much that it's just kind of deflating? I'm sorry. You may have heard me tell Jill earlier that Pastor Jill, that the last time I did this, I had like 5, maybe 6 hours, and it was 5 passages. And I talked so much, and there was still like 15, 20 minutes each passage to kind of go back and forth. And so I apologize if I'm talking too much. We have enough time, I think, that surely one person can answer that question in your lecture outline. What do you, and I've forgotten what it is, but it's something to do with what shifts, how do the different dials on your church's soundboard kind of get readjusted when, what a weird metaphor that was, when everything starts to conform to this mission of healing. It doesn't have to be necessarily how we interpret a Sabbath law. I think that's just a really good test case for how this is kind of lived out.
I believe you have a taker, Doctor.
All right, Alan.
Well, sir, I served a church about 12 miles from the Canadian border at the time when they started a healing ministry. Very small rural congregation. And that very act became basically a revitalization of the congregation. It opened it to most of the neighbors, which they were pretty close with anyway, being a small community. But in a curious way, we had more Pentecostal folks who joined, Southern Baptist, and I'm saying you can't get any further north than the St. Lawrence River. Plus Lutherans, Methodists. It became a community gathering as opposed to just this small group of Lutherans who were seeking healing with anointing. It just became a very exciting element added to the church. And I was sad to leave that when I left for another call, but that was where they were headed. So I hope that answers some of your question.
Well, that's a beautiful answer to the question, for sure. And I think it's a window, I would say, into how healing draws people, and not always the people that you're kind of scripted to serve and minister to. So when you think too of the stories about physical healing, but when you think too of the fact, frankly, that in the Gospels healing is so multi-layered, the reconciliation of estranged people, the sharing of material resources, social inclusion, which we'll actually get to in the next passage. When you start to think beyond just physical healing, I think you start to really open up a whole host of answers to this question about what changes when everything is made to conform to a mission of healing. If the mission of healing is so multi-layered, then that might be why the soundboard metaphor, maybe it works, because there's lots of different things you're doing in a church that have to do with the kinds of people you're bringing together, maybe embodied ministry of healing that Alan's referring to, how you use your resources, how you help the poor. You know, if you've got these kind of dials set in a way that maybe it's humming, maybe you're happy, maybe it's status quo. I don't know your churches as well as you do, but if everything is made to conform to a kind of multifaceted mission of healing, how do those dials get does that make sense? Kind of recalibrated or redone? It's an interesting question. And again, maybe it's more of a leadership pastoral ministry question than it is a preaching question per se, but it might nonetheless generate some ideas for preaching. Pastor Devin Strong has a hand up, and he's a Wolverines fan.
Amen. Just a quick question. What makes you think that the woman is accepted in the community, welcomed into the community? I mean, of course, the typical thing is that folks with disabilities were outcasts or not particularly welcome in the community. You at least imagine this as a more positive, her more positive participation in the community. And one of the things that I notice in the text is that the woman is brought front and center by Jesus. And I have to think that that was pretty significant for her. Is there anything, I don't see anything in the text, but maybe you have other background that makes you think that this is not a typically outcast woman?
Yeah.
I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, great question. That's a great exegetical question too. Yeah, so there's no disputing that Jesus brings her front and center, right? So I think I'm fine with saying that there's kind of an extra effort, as it were, to shine a light on this woman, whether we want to call it greater inclusion or not, I don't know. I think my response to why do I think she's not outcast is, why would we think she is outcast? And I think those have to do a lot with assumptions both about Judaism and projecting our own modern culture of outcasting differently abled people. This is a culture where what we would now call differently abledness, people with physical infirmities, it's just part of everyday life. Just, it's hard not to walk down a street and not find someone pre-modern medicine who we wouldn't identify as having a physical infirmity of. So I don't want to overstate it, right? I just want to say that I think we live more in a culture of removing the differently abled from our midst than Jesus's own culture, whether it's Jewish or not. So, and I think that I'm not, and Pastor Devin, I'm not saying you did this at all, but I do think, because I think there was a time in my career where I fell victim to this. I do think there's sometimes a tendency among us Christians we just have this kind of default. We want to make Jesus the Messiah by setting him over against a more oppressive Judaism. And so we sometimes kind of work a kind of anti-Jewish bias into it as well. Based on what I know of the culture of Jesus' day, this is, just a woman who's going to synagogue. But what Jesus sees is a window for a physical healing. And he brings her front and center to give her this gift. I suspect that there's a little bit of literary artistry at work on Luke's part too, because I suspect Luke knows he's moving quickly to describe a debate between two leaders, and putting the woman in front and center kind of, facilitates that to an extent. But I actually don't see any evidence in the text that she is socially outcast. I mean, she's in the synagogue, for instance, and there's, So it's a great question. It's a great question. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus' culture didn't, like all cultures, have, and we'll get to this in the next passage when it comes to table fellowship. I'm not at all saying that Jesus' culture, like virtually every human culture ever, didn't have marginalized peoples, right? Or people that were outcast. I just don't think, I mean, heck, you just go to a developing country at any point and just kind of drive down a dirt road, and you're going to see people bent over like this because they've been carrying water for their whole lives up a steep incline 3 times a day. You know what I mean? It's just not that uncommon. It's not the same, for instance, Pastor Devin, as what the gospel texts call leprosy. You know, a series of kind of skin diseases that could prove contagious, somehow contagious. And it also wouldn't have been ritually unclean just to be bent over, just to kind of add a next, I think, insight into that. Yes, Reverend Jan Setzler.
Yes, sir. I'm just sitting here thinking also about the question and realizing at that same time that there is a theological understanding in Jesus' time of a correlation between sin and sickness that he's already come against. You know, tell us, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should have this affliction? You know, and so that was a powerful teaching moment. And I wonder, to a certain extent, if she doesn't embody all over again that wonderful attitude toward, no, it's an opportunity here to set people free.
Yeah, there's no, and this seems to be what you're saying. There's no evidence of anyone connecting the woman's condition to, you know, sins or it being a punishment for that. And in Jesus, you know, we can find kind of opposing arguments in Scripture about this. You know, the extent to which someone's physical infirmity might be a result of divine punishment of sorts. You already have my answer to what I think of that. But then you also have perspectives to the contrary in the Bible, not just in the New Testament, but in the Old. And Jesus kind of consistently sides with the what we might call the kind of non-punitive explanation. Again, not something that he magically made up, but something that he agrees with, inherited and agrees with, that physical infirmity is not a divine punishment of any sort.
So in some ways, I think, you know, in terms of, if you want to look at other healing stories in contrast, I mean, the woman that's hemorrhaging is unclean in terms of Jewish law, where this woman's in synagogue is present in the community and yet still needs healing. And to your own point of, you know, just her day in, day out life may be the reason why she's bent over, rather than some kind of, you know, it's just what happens when you live in a world where, you know, it's really hauling water and not just picking up a Dasani bottle. You know, and so that contrast of your question about what would our context, what would our community be if we were focused on healing homeless, I think in some ways it goes to the question of, you know, what do you need to be healed of? I think so much of healing, so much of recognizing is that there's always somebody else. I don't need it. I don't need that, but that person does. And so for Jesus in the story, it is just a woman who, because of life, when we don't know why, is bent over. And so the compassion or the necessary act of healing comes just because she's in need. And who among us is not in need? That too often we want to point out the one who, you know, is physically, you know, showing that they're not like us, and so they're the ones who are wrong, as opposed to, each of us has some need for healing.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's important to always note that the mission of healing and reconciliation is multi-layered. And again, we have to be careful and nuanced with, because I've read some literature from a perspective of disability that is that criticizes the way we can too easily make physical infirmities metaphors for, kind of spiritualize them into other things. So there's traps all around, kind of pastorally and theologically, but I don't think that should stop us from emphasizing that individually we need healing at multiple levels. Communally, congregationally, our systems need healing at multiple levels. And when you have the kind of the pedal to the metal, as Jesus does, locked in on this mission and this mission alone, other things kind of get altered, reordered, as I put it, in connection with the last passage. And our last passage actually is an interesting, it's almost providential that it follows, because it does give us an example of how a kind of social healing might prove disruptive in the form of table fellowship. Let me pull up my screen share again. Just take a minute to read this passage. This might take a little longer. It might be our longest passage. You'll notice that the lectionary omits verses 2 through 6, which is just another Sabbath controversy similar to the one we just had. While it might seem insignificant at first, I want to say a little bit about the first verse. So here I'm going to try to go in better narrative order, I guess. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. This is probably not an insight that's going to preach, but maybe you'll find something worth passing along. And if not, maybe it's just kind of helpful for you as an exegete and a theologian. I mentioned previously that I think the Gospels exaggerate the extent to which Jesus butted heads with the Jewish leaders of the day. Not that Jesus didn't butt heads with leaders occasionally, maybe even regularly. Pharisees, scribes, in the case of his Galilean ministry. But even saying something like regularly debating is less, I think, than what the Gospels are indicating, which is something more like Jesus never met a Jewish leader who didn't oppose him. Again, historically, I think it's not very likely that that's the case, but it does serve the evangelist's rhetorical aims to depict Jesus in a near constant state of superior argumentation against rival leaders. And it should be said, each gospel gives some exceptions to that rule of near constant disagreement, near constant opposition. Each gospel gives some exceptions to that rule. And I think those exceptions give us a window, I think, into some relationships that were, historically speaking, probably more prevalent. So, for example, in the case of Luke, Jesus isn't, I think of Nicodemus, who has, while it's a confusing conversation, it's at least a relatively pleasant conversation with Jesus in John 3. But in the case of Luke, Jesus is invited to dine at the house of 3 different Pharisees. And yes, debate always ensues, but the very fact that Jesus is invited, I think, tells us something important about his acceptance or some degree of acceptance among at least some leaders. And then this scene in chapter 14 is the third and final of those 3 table fellowship scenes in the house of a Pharisee. And the grammar of verse 1 may suggest that the host Pharisee is not even part of the group that is observing Jesus, presumably with malintent. It's at least ambiguous. I suspect that a lot of Christians will assume that Jesus was invited simply so that he could be observed and trapped. We do have some stories that talk about kind of intentions to entrap, as if he were like that weird new kid in a high school cafeteria in one of those awful teen movies. Let's play a prank on the new kid. We'll invite him to our table. But that's not really how table fellowship worked in the ancient world, as I'll explain in a moment. Right now, just worth knowing that there is a new book about the Pharisees that's already listed in the handout I gave you about combating anti-Jewish interpretation, and I've singled it out in your lecture outline also, simply called The Pharisees, a collection of essays edited by Joseph Sievers and Amy Jill Levine. And I would lift up especially chapter 24, which is entitled Preaching and Teaching the Pharisees. But there are also some interesting chapters. Not some of these chapters are like painstakingly historical and textual, but there's some interesting chapters on the origins of the Pharisees, what it means for Paul to have been a Pharisee, how close Jesus historically might have been to Pharisees, Pharisees as they're depicted in patristic literature, Pharisees as depicted in the writings of Luther and Calvin, gulp, and Pharisees even in modern film, which would be interesting. Our passage continues at any rate in verse 7, when Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. And I've already pointed out in connection with our previous passage how Jesus has a habit of careful and compassionate observation. Jesus notices things that others might not. And similarly, in this passage, it's interesting to me that both the other invitees at this meal, as well as Jesus, are in a mode of close observation. Luke uses different verbs, maybe more for artistic variation, but the two parties are more or less doing the same thing, observing carefully. It seems with different priorities, looking for different things, we might say, but they're observing things carefully. And in the case of Jesus, as we might expect of him, especially in Luke, he's noticing social behaviors around food and table fellowship. As you probably already know, Luke, among the evangelists, shows the most interest in meals and table fellowship, with 19 scenes that touch on meals and table fellowship, and 13 of those being unique to Luke's gospel. And when you read through those scenes, it becomes clear that for Luke, as I say in your lecture outline, table fellowship functions as a kind of microcosm of the kingdom. Why zero in on table fellowship? Because the way a society or group practices table fellowship tends to encapsulate the overall cultural dynamics, whether it's exclusion or inclusion, welcome, marginalization, self-promotion, more service-oriented, or in the words of Louise Gospel in her book, she says, meals are an expression of a society's views on acceptable behavior. Meals are an expression of a society's views on acceptable behavior, including gender roles, socioeconomic status, and more. That's a quote I got from the Reed and Matthews commentary. Of course, it helps to know a little bit about the Greco-Roman patronage system. So at the risk of giving you too much history, I just think it's highly relevant for this passage and a lot of other meal scenes in Luke and the Gospels. And to be clear, we see evidence of systems like this in many cultures, including our own, ancient, medieval, modern, but the Roman Empire really kind of perfected it in some ways. Of course, what I'm calling a system, a patronage system, is really just deep-seated cultural convention, whereby, in this case, the poorer and less powerful classes of people curried favor, or often curried favor, with wealthier and more socially powerful patrons, usually a single patron per family, and often over the course of several generations. The wealthier and more powerful patron, or benefactor, as they might be called, would abide these long-term relationships with the male patriarchs of various socially inferior families, hosting them at meals, often in leisure activities like a bathhouse, the meals being, I think, what I'm going to focus on just because of Luke's own emphasis. But the meals, and in some cases, the leisure activities, would function as gifts and also lay a foundation of trust and reciprocity. That's an important word, reciprocity, whereby the wealthier patrons would use these relationships to build and extend the kind of political support they needed as more aristocratic citizens, while the lesser clients and their families could rely on their patrons for greater provision in times of need. Again, usually with the expectation of reciprocity appropriate to the gift, which is to say that patronage was often helpful as a matter of basic survival in some cases. And also to a limited extent, these relationships of patronage could pave the way for the client's limited self-promotion or social promotion, which meant by implication, the social promotion of the client's family. And I think that prospect of social promotion is part or most of what Jesus is addressing in Luke 14, at least in the verses about where people are choosing to sit. I've given you an interesting and kind of playful short video that I use in class now about what the life of a client in Rome might have looked like from day to day. And this is all to say that especially outside of the immediate household, meals carried considerable social meaning. They involved delicate power dynamics. They cultivated behaviors of self-interest, which does not necessarily preclude genuine solidarity of a sort. But to the degree that there was a real sense of solidarity, it was typically experienced under the pressures of unequal patron-client power dynamics, anxiety about status, the preservation of status, the gaining of status. Trying to think of examples, and the best, this is not so much an example from experience, but I can imagine a good example would be how meals might function in a kind of business networking context. If you can picture yourself, maybe some of you had previous lives in this context, I don't know. A young aspiring business person invited to the home of maybe a more prominent, more powerful business person. Maybe you know some of the other people invited, but the relationships are primarily business related. And there's this unspoken spirit of kind of ladder climbing, currying the host's favor. And of course, the host is fully aware of this and understands the benefits that he or she might enjoy as a quality host. Again, not that there can't be some semblance of friendship or solidarity in that. And none of this is to say that similar dynamics aren't at work in other pockets of our society, not least the church. Anyway, before we turn to Jesus's critique of this system, it bears mentioning that among historians, this Greco-Roman or Roman patronage culture or system is not always the object of outright scorn among historians. As I've already noted, within limits, patronage could provide for people in need. So in certain aspects, it was the best Roman society could, offer or manage in those circumstances. But it was still a system predicated on unequal and often oppressive social power relations. Outside of perhaps the occasional insightful and wise philosopher, Plutarch, for instance, the inequalities and the oppressive system was not itself questioned. Bearing that context in mind, we can make sense of why the Lucan Jesus takes table fellowship so seriously. To the extent that God's kingdom heals human brokenness, including social and communal brokenness, it will directly challenge the systems that uphold the brokenness. But not just challenge, I think we find in Jesus that his kingdom ministry really builds a sort of counterculture. And Jesus zeroes in specifically on table fellowship as a way to exemplify what that counterculture looks like. And at times his teaching takes the perspective of the meal host, and at times it emphasizes a kind of proactive, radical, at times his teaching takes the perspective of the meal host and emphasizes proactive, radical inclusion. And at times, especially in this passage, it also can take the perspective of the people that are invited. I want to start first with the perspective of the host, which actually takes us straight down to verses 12 and following. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. One might add to that, you will be repaid insofar as you are entering into relationships with beautiful people. At any rate, these are the kinds of guests that would obviously not benefit a patron or a benefactor per se. One might conceive of inviting such people in the names of token philanthropy and the honor that that philanthropy can bring. And that did happen in the Greco-Roman world, but no patron would consider this kind of banquet strategy, right? Jesus is giving like a strategy for hosting meals. And this is not something that would fly within a culture predicated on systems of patronage. But this is precisely the strategy that Jesus teaches, because his kingdom mission aims to heal human brokenness, not only at the individual level, but at the broader social communal level. Again, Jesus building a kind of countercultural culture, which isn't to say that individuals aren't impacted as well. Of course, individuals are impacted when cultural systems are healed. In this case, we find Jesus prioritizing the inclusion and well-being of the socially outcast and the downtrodden. He names them the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. But we might also imagine benefit coming to anyone who opens up their home in this way. Healing comes to everyone, but the teaching is directed to the potential hosts who have the social capital to expend on behalf of Jesus's kingdom mission. I think churches and church leaders are channeling verses like these, verses 12 through 14. When they speak about inclusion and welcome and hospitality, they may struggle. We all know this, they may struggle to enact this kind of radical inclusion and to really embody it. That's the challenge. But they're at least beginning, I'm noticing, to get their messaging kind of consistent with verses like this. At the church where my family attends here in Columbia, for example, the mission statement says that everyone has a place at the table. It's a wonderful phrase. Everyone has a place at the table. It's both a Eucharistic statement and a social kind of communal fellowship statement. And that kind of statement's a great starting point, provided it can get fleshed out in more detail and isn't just a statement. Which brings me to the second and equally important question. Sure, we all have a place, but what place do we have? What place do we seek? What place do we relinquish for the well-being of others and the flourishing of the entire community, including myself? So there's not just inclusion in the sense of reaching out and inviting people, but also the vital second step towards living out a deeper form of inclusion. Here I'm just quoting from my lecture outline: inclusion that decenters insiders, not rejects insiders, but decenters insiders in order to lift up outsiders. This, I think, is the dynamic that's addressed in verses 7 through 11. When he noticed how the guests or the invitees chose the places of honor, that word is literally like the first reclines, because we can imagine in the Greco-Roman context, not chairs, but people reclining around a table, kind of in a U shape. He told them this parable: when you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished The Greek is more honored, respected, esteemed, more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take or occupy the lowest place, the last place in Greek. But when you are invited, go and sit or recline, literally, at the lowest place or the last place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. The Greek says literally, then it will be for your glory before all the ones reclining with you. And then we have a statement that seems to derive from Mark, which provides a kind of final and succinct summary of the teaching in verse 11. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled or abased, and those who humble themselves will be exalted or lifted up. Now, my hope is that with all the historical and cultural context I've provided, this makes a bit more sense. You can see that Jesus has in mind an invited guest who is accustomed to using table fellowship as a means of self-promotion, seeking greater proximity to the client being the host who would recline at the head of the table. By contrast, Jesus counsels the other guests in this home of the Pharisee to seek out the lower ranked places. And there's the maxim driving this in verse 11, because those who exalt themselves will be humbled and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Without this final summary statement in verse 11, verses 8 through 10 can just sound like a shrewd manipulation of the system, right? This is an important caveat that I think needs to be made if you're really going to tackle these verses. Just owning up to the fact that verses 8 through 10, taken by themselves, sound like Jesus is teaching these people just to manipulate the system for their own self-promotion. So aim low so that you can avoid the shame of being lowered, and with the expectation that you might hopefully be moved to a higher seat, thereby gaining some degree of honor for yourself. But once we add verse 11, we see that this is not so much the manipulation of a system, but the upending of a system, especially when we consider how Luke's gospel periodically and somewhat distinctively highlights social reversals. So, for instance, Mary's Magnificat, perhaps the most memorable instance of reversal we have in Luke, where Mary says, God has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts, brought down the powerful from their thrones, lifted up the lowly, filled the hungry with good things, sent the rich away empty. It's not hard to think of the Magnificat when we hear Jesus say here in chapter 14, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. As Mary already knew, God is in the business of overturning these oppressive systems and hierarchies for the well-being of those in need. And I think we would add for the well-being of those who perpetuate them. Or to put it in language closer to the language of the day, God is in the business of redefining honor. It sounds a little bit like Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 too. God honors the very ones whom society typically ascribes shame. As Jesus will later tell his own disciples during his Last Supper with them in chapter 22, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority called over them are called, guess what? Benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. We're mixing kind of table fellowship metaphors here. Invited guests, where do you sit? Do you serve? Do you partake? But at any rate, these verses also help us see that the reversal underway is, I think, deeply Christologically driven. Or the reversal, better put, the reversal itself is Christological in form, insofar as Jesus is the one who, as the anointed King of Israel, lowers himself to the form of a servant for the benefit of the poor and downtrodden. As Paul will say, and yes, I'm actually going outside of Luke here, in Philippians 2, Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being born in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God highly exalted him. We could keep reading about that exaltation in verses 10 through 13, but all of these verses help us, I think, make sense of Luke 14:11. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted, thereby helping us get past the optics of verses 8 through 10, so that we can understand them not as instructions in the manipulation of an oppressive system, but rather as something that's moving ultimately towards the upending of that system itself. Taking into consideration that broader context of Luke and the New Testament, the true meaning of verse 10 is that we aim low, so to speak, not because we secretly hope to be moved higher, rather we aim low out of love for the other, because we have their best interest in mind, because aiming for social exaltation is not, or at least not always, in our best interest, because we are participating in a kingdom mission that is greater than ourselves, a kingdom mission that heals broken systems and lives into healthy systems of inclusion and welcome and fellowship and love. Jesus is describing how we might get the ball rolling, in other words, for a healthier system. How do we get the ball rolling? Let's start with something we do virtually every week, or at least with some regularity in our own churches, which is gathering around a table or tables for a meal. And the flip side, again, at the risk of repeating myself, is that some people do need a promotion of sorts. This is a statement that I don't think is in your outline or in my slides, but I'll just read it from the Reed and Matthews commentary. They write, "It is important to be cognizant of one's social location before taking to heart Jesus's admonition to take the last place and to humble oneself." End quote. Driggers here continuing, because there are some for whom shame must be replaced with honor. Maybe you know some of these people in your congregations or on your doorsteps. Some who should be served and not served. The question Jesus might ask is, are those not only the people our churches serve occasionally, but also the people of whom our churches consist, and that our church therefore empowers on a regular basis? There are other broader questions in your lecture outline. What do you notice about the people within your congregations, and what do you notice about yourself? Remember, Jesus notices things. When it comes to the dynamics of social inclusion specifically, and fellowship specifically, remember, Jesus is a leader that notices these things. I can imagine, or I can envision Jesus entering a fellowship hall, for example, doing the normal kind of conversational stuff, laughing it up, offering a blessing for the meal like you all have to do. But then I can also see Jesus taking a step back once everyone gets in line for the potluck. And I can see Jesus kind of with his back against the wall, just kind of taking it all in. Of course, if Jesus is in anything like a fellowship, the fellowship halls I've been a part of, he's not observing how people position themselves at a single table, but he's observing how people group themselves at smaller tables. So it's not exactly apples to apples, but in that scenario, the seats of honor maybe aren't quite as obvious, but with the right kind of vision, I think we notice actions of discipleship and service, as well as acts of self-promotion, or if not self-promotion, certainly, speaking for myself, kind of self-protection. I'm an introvert. Self-protection, maybe self-preservation. So what would we observe? Do we see inclusivity in the sense of a healthy diversity? If not, we might want to meditate more on verses 12 through 14 and rethink who we are inviting. And if our congregations do exhibit some degree of diversity, there's that next question: where do people sit? How do they position themselves in relation to one another? Because only with that question, I think, are we really getting to the fullness of how, kingdom community happens. I suspect you'll see some people who really know how to cut through status and posturing in order to really embody welcome. Maybe they're more naturally, comfortable with that. Or maybe they have the courage just to move out of their comfort zones to be in solidarity with those they would not otherwise choose to eat with. I suspect you'll also see quite a bit of people gravitating towards the ones they already know and are comfortable with. Or if they're like me, they're almost always going to sit with their own immediate families. I have a tendency just to find one of my kids and sit with them and play the part of really great dad, when part of me is like, I'm kind of scared to sit and meet with people I don't know. Never mind that I'm the one who just an hour ago made a big to-do about how the church undermines family as your primary ground of identity. I'm not coming here with magic tricks for fostering a more countercultural community like the ones envisioned in Luke, but it does seem to me that when it comes to leadership and strategy, table fellowship is a good place to begin. You might say low-hanging fruit insofar, again, as it happens with some regularity over the course of the month and the year. And these are just ideas that I've kind of experienced in roles of lay leadership in churches, like training or covenanting with church council members to practice more radical table fellowship that can generate new relationships and hopefully friendships. I think that's especially helpful insofar as that church council, it was a vestry in my case, kind of, you rotate through new members. And so you can kind of start to create some semblance of a counterculture that way. You can bring greater intentionality to how you kind of organize seating arrangements, maybe not name plates per se, but, I don't know, doing something intentional with congregations about that. My mother-in-law would also have a whole series of question prompts that get conversations going. This is just me spitballing. Again, they're not magic tricks, but they're things in my head when I think of how this passage could be lived out in a congregational setting, with the conviction that the discipleship we practice with one another might carry over into the everyday world, so that our churches can be lights to the world. Windows into the kingdom that Jesus brings to the world. Wow, 3:58. But of course, I'll stay as long as we need to. So, a lot to take in, two angles on table fellowship, one from the perspective of the host, one from the perspective of the guest. Not the manipulation of a system, but more, I would argue, the upending of a system. And it helps to know something about the cultural context of Greco-Roman patronage for all of this to make sense, of why Jesus is making such a big deal out of it. Because I suspect he's seen this kind of posturing quite a bit in his own culture, just as we have. Follow-up questions for me or answers to questions I have posed to you?
Why does a revised common lectionary committee think that last passage is a helpful one? All that you have just explained is, I'm on board, and it's a lot on a Sunday morning to get across, right? So like, what's the insight here that, it's not fair to ask you, but here I am doing it anyway.
What's the logic of this passage that we just covered, you mean?
Yeah.
As opposed to what, Matt? Just kind of going past it? Because the committee does gloss over passages sometimes. I don't know the answer. I wish I did know the answer to that. I do, and it didn't really occur to me in my some of my more frantic prep, but as I was engaging you all with the last passage, there does seem to be a kind of unfolding logic, at least to these four passages that we've talked about, kind of different angles on what a counterculture might look like. You know, first with respect to possessions. What was the second one? I already forgot what the second one was. It was near the end of chapter 12. Oh, possessions, then kind of how the role of family and the kind of decentering of family. The bent over woman that passage might be somewhat of an outlier, but it at least is getting to the point of just how central and animating, as it were, this mission is, so that everything else conforms to it. And then our final angle on this counterculture is kind of focusing on table fellowship and who you invite. So not having pushed further than August, I can at least say that there's kind of a wonderful logic, which maybe it's to the credit of Luke more than it is to any lectionary committee, to lay out different angles on what this kind of countercultural kingdom looks like and the way it upends, various of our kind of conventions. That's all I got.
And it certainly follows the narrative track too. We're just moving forward.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's
sure.
something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
And maybe that kind of overarching kind of narrative trajectory might be something you can kind of start with. It kind of starts, frankly, this coming Sunday with the parable of the rich fool. That's at least thematically, this upcoming Sunday's gospel reading is tethered kind of naturally to the next Sunday's bit about sell your possessions and give alms. So you might want to start even this next Sunday with, some words about kind of the trajectory we're setting out on in terms of, different ways that Jesus kind of cultivates a counterculture that's predicated on healing and reconciliation.
Well, I know I want to thank you, Dr. Driggers, for all this today. It was a lot. 1 month doesn't seem like we've done some of these where it's been the whole season in a 4-hour period of time, and you would think that as we come into these waning days of summer, it wouldn't be so deep, but it was. And so thanks for your presentation today, for your handouts, for the conversation. I did put in the chat box, if you'd like to financially support these formation events, there is a way you can give to those, and also an opportunity for a survey there. And I pray everything went really well, because in the middle of that last section, my internet went out at my house. So I'm really grateful I made you a co-host so that we didn't knock everybody off. So I had a little bit of a heart attack, and the 5 hairs I have left on my head just fell out. But I am very, very grateful for your time today, and for your introvertedness that came and came to share in this arena, which is not always easy. It's hard when it's a 2-dimensional setting to get a feeling for how people are and what they're taking and what they're getting from it, as opposed to in a lecture hall where you can see people frantically writing things down and opening up Bibles to look back at passages, which I know all of these folks were doing behind their screens. So please know that folks have been writing in the chat box how much they have appreciated our time today. And as he said, he's willing to stay on, but for those of you that have other things that you need to do in your life, again, thank you for being with us this afternoon. There will be an email that will come with all of the handouts again, in case you didn't download them and save them to your computer, as well as a copy of the recording of the lecture. And then whenever we get our next one set, we're happy to have you join us again as we move into September and October. And maybe after today, you've decided that you know, August, you're just going to do some kind of theme sermon that has nothing to do with the lectionary, or, you know, go with God and know that the Holy Spirit goes with you in the midst of this. So thank you all for this afternoon. If you want to stick around for more conversation, you're more than welcome to.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.